Let's just close our eyes for a bit and remember our childhood. This sort of exercise usually encourages us to think of innocence and whimsy. Honestly, my memory is more of a time with arbitrary rules and authoritarian control of my life by forces I had no power over. I mean, more so than today. But one thing I do remember being easier was imagination, maybe because the whole world was still alien to me. You might be having a day by the riverside and become enamored with the world of fantastic creatures and plants surrounding you, weird and enormous beyond understanding. So much beauty, so much excitement, so much danger. As an adult, you might endeavor to recreate that experience. A world that is wondrous and mystical and so welcoming. And doing everything in its power to kill you. You need to know this, kids. The only thing that is certain is death. Anyway, Rayman by Michel Ancel. While it's just about cliche to put the... You can open your eyes now. While it's just about cliche to put the difficulty of Rayman front and center when talking or writing about it, there's not really any way around that. It's flat out bizarre to juxtapose the look of the game with the reality of playing it. But that doesn't seem like it was the point of the game. Rather, it was an accident. According to the game director of Rayman Origins, Sebastian Morin, very little playtesting had disguised to the designers just how difficult the first game really was when they were making it. We'll cover this topic in more detail soon. First, let's establish how a Rayman game should be talked about in my opinion. I think there are three main pillars that characterize them. First, gorgeous art. Second, amazing music and sound. And third is polished level design and mechanics. Noting that gameplay innovation is not on that list, Rayman favors quality over treading new grounds in how it is played. It is a little more innovative with the first pillar though, the art. Not that a cartoonish aesthetic hadn't been seen already in games, obviously not, but there is a sense that anything goes in the world of Rayman that I don't think was matched by the other big hitters of the genre at the time. Expressive personality, dynamic animations for both living things and inanimate objects, and the odd limbless character design all in some small way contribute to this picture. This isn't incidental either. Looking good was central to the game's design, maybe even more so than gameplay, as can be seen from a key decision made during development. The original incarnation of the game was for the Super Nintendo CD version, but this console was never to be released. Once Ubisoft found this out, they had to pick new hardware as the game's home, and the choice was made that it would be the Atari Jaguar, not based on ease or familiarity, but based on graphical power. Rayman is a visual world, and Ancel knew early that it would need something that could effectively portray that. The results can be seen easily just by a glance at the game. That old phrase, every frame a painting, does indeed come to mind. Talking to my own tastes, I'll specifically gush about the Blue Mountains. The color palette favors dark, cool tones with washed out greens and browns. The towering mountains make up the background with what seems to be giant purple veils wrapping around the ridges as you hike down gentle slopes and snow-covered peaks. It's absolutely gorgeous. The only bad thing is that the Blue Mountains near Sydney do not look like this. When you're done just staring in awe at the world, you can then go on to enjoy the characters within it. Rayman boasts some of the smoothest and best drawn animations you'll see from games at the time, and quite a variety to boot. The game even has little animation shows against a black background every so often. They're largely pointless, but always fun to see. The other characters also have a variety of unique designs and animations just as strong as for Rayman himself. Some of the best ones are rarely seen, but even lacking them, the approach they take to spotting Rayman, getting hit, or even just walking can make their character pop out nicely. The art is breathtaking indeed, but for me a game can look amazing all at once, but will never be quite enough unless it also sounds amazing. Rayman aces this test too. The soundtrack is every bit as impressive as the visuals. The echo heard in the Cave of Scops gives a sense of deep, unknown depths. The Blue Mountains music mimics a call from afar, and Bandland makes a score of many different instruments and melodies coming together. This time my greatest favor goes to Picture City. I absolutely love this first track. Perfection. Just perfection. However, this soundscape as presented to me is incomplete. This is the opening track to the first level. And this is me playing that level. It's missing. At first, anyway. When the music does eventually play, it's a different track that's intended for the cave world later on, not the jungle we're currently in. This is the most egregious example, but several pieces from the soundtrack are simply missing from the game, which results in repetition of what little we have, or the occasional eerie silence. What's going on here is that I'm playing the PC version of the game. According to Rayman's wiki, the PC port had multiple releases, most of which lacked the full soundtrack seen in some console versions. Possibly a reaction to the disk space at the time, where a hard drive probably only had a gigabyte at max. In fact, an old review from GameSpot declared that the 50 megabytes needed for Rayman's opening cinematic was ridiculous. God, that was another time. Combine that with the fact that the most accessible version of the game for PC these days, and the one I'm playing, is Rayman Forever, released in 1999. This version also included a level editing tool and a bunch of fan-made levels. With so much already in the bundle, it's understandable that they wanted to keep the file sizes down. But it most certainly comes at a price. The soundtrack isn't the only casualty either. That 50 megabyte opening cutscene is also removed in Rayman Forever, leaving you to simply start playing with no context. That very well could be what some players are after. No harm, no foul to them. But for others, this is probably over-minimalistic, even for the time it came out. I don't think anyone is going into it expecting paragraphs of lore, but absolutely nothing is probably a little too far the other way. So if, like me, you're stuck with the PC version, you can either read the manual or look up the cinematic on YouTube to get the story and setting. To summarize it, the world of Rayman is kept at peace and harmony by something called the Great Protoon and the Electoons that orbit it. Then the villain, Mr. Dark, the names are very creative in this game, stole it, and the world turned out to be a bit rubbish after that. Numerous hostiles started appearing everywhere and locking the Electoons in cages. Only one guy can free them and defeat the evil Mr. Dark, Rayman! And he does. Yeah, that's the whole plot. I know a lot of stories, good stories in fact, could technically be summarized in a similar way, but they invariably have details that make them interesting and or meaningful. While for Rayman, that really is pretty much it. The only story-related event that happens between the start and the end is Rayman's ally, Batilla the Fairy, getting captured, and even that doesn't result in any growth or revelation, just drama. It's very, very bare bones, but funnily enough, the storytelling in Rayman is actually fantastic. Not the story itself, but how the game gets information across to you. But that's a topic for a bit later in the video. The PC version does have something else that leaves it distinct from the various console releases. Level design. Few major changes, but an extra ring here, an Electoon cage moved there, perhaps slightly bigger platforms where they are a little too rare. So when I say Rayman had not been playtested, that's not entirely true for all its releases. The PC version came out a little later than Rayman's most well-known incarnation on the PlayStation, and thus the PlayStation version and its contemporaries effectively were the playtest for the PC version. Sometimes this would manifest by simply easing up on the challenges in the game, but what I like better is when the challenges are kept, but made optional. For example, these needles here, you need to get past them to complete the level, and are shrunk down to a small size, which makes dodging them relatively easy with good use of your powers. But what if you think to go through them while still at normal size? A much harder task, but not impossible by any means. The developers can then put some challenges and rewards that can only be accessed while at this larger size for those who did this. In this case, there are 2 extra lives to be had, but the greater prize is external to the game. The exciting feeling of having discovered something that you may well have missed if you were less observant or less skilled. This is what it's like here on the PC. But that's not the case for the PS1. Instead, it puts an item in this location that you need to finish the game. It is a requirement to navigate the needles at a larger size, not an extra. Thus, the sense of discovery is mitigated, if not entirely lost. Achievement is still there, but it is in a muted form. Changes like this show that the port wasn't a half-assed afterthought, but had decent care and effort put into it. Yet somehow, they didn't rewrite the in-game text to reflect the change to keyboard. It still assumes you're using a Jaguar controller. Irritating, but thankfully there's not many buttons to get confused over, and you're free to redefine your controls whenever you like, so you probably know where the buttons you want are anyway. As much as the port did make it easier for the players, they still left plenty of high-level compulsory challenges in. I suppose by the time the later releases came out, it was already the game's signature reputation that it will kick you into the dirt and then stamp on the back of your head. So let's stop dancing around this now and talk about difficulty. This is going to take a while, just so you know. I will start with this level, Eat at Joe's. I hate it. I hate it so fucking much, all because of these loathsome fish. They will jump up, are incredibly hard to dodge or punch, and if they hit you, you're dead. Sorry, do the entire thing again. That's the level for me. Not the first one I got stuck on for a while, but the one that made me wonder why the fuck I ever wanted to play this game. For you, it may be this. Or this. Or this. Or God knows what else. The game will always have another absurd and borderline unfair, if not blatantly unfair, challenge just over the next hill. But while this is true, I don't think it really accounts for the game's reputation. I've been playing some Celeste lately, and it too has some very difficult sections that can stop you for a very long time. Any challenge can eventually be bumbled through if you keep hitting your head against it though. What makes Rayman different is that it doesn't want you to just finish the levels, it wants you to master them. Let's now list the features and systems that contribute to this. Number 1. Rayman has a few hit points, but it doesn't always feel like it because when he takes damage he is thrown back, and is often greeted with a fatal fall, drowning in water, or another hazard that is arbitrarily lethal. This is not always the case, but certainly often enough to warrant many do-overs for small mistakes. Number 2. Rayman will not just accept you completing the levels, but you must also open every Electoon cage in them. This involves completing many puzzles that will kill you for failure, but the bigger problem is just finding the damn things. Leaps of faith are required, most of which won't pay off, and counterintuitive backtracking is also a big part of this. This example I'm showing now requires both, and is probably the worst in the game. I simply looked up the cage locations, and I recommend you do the same. To whoever found them initially to make those guides, I salute you. Number 3, expanding on the previous point, you don't have access to your full move kit from the start of the game. A good thing from a progress point of view, but it does mean that you'll have to go back to previous levels where you needed powers you didn't yet have to get some cages. A level that is very hard and you're glad to get past will often need to be repeated for this reason, and will cost you a good number of additional lives. As a tangential note, when Rayman is given a new power, there's always a sense of, why couldn't we do that before? The power to punch, the power to run, the power to grab things, the power to grab things and then hold on to them, the power to use your hair as a post-industrial aerial vehicle, you know, mundane things. Number 4, Rayman has the oh-so-dreaded live system that was still prominent in the 90s. Normally death will return you to a checkpoint, which take the form of photographers. Any cages you've opened will still be counted and you won't need to get them again. But run out of lives and you'll at least need to replay the levels in this area, and this time the cages aren't saved. Not an uncommon thing for the time, but Rayman makes lives quite sparse after the first few levels, and positions them in such a way that you'll likely die and thus lose a life while trying to get them, making them more of a trap than a reward. Plus, they don't ever respawn once collected, even when re-entering an area. And number 5. The game has a few power-ups that make you stronger. One increases your hit point total, one improves the power of your attacks, and one adds range. Dying will basically take all of this away, leaving only the range if you have multiple levels of it, but will still reduce it to its weakest form. This means that if you fail to beat a challenge with these power-ups, well, now you're left to do it without them. Good luck. Adding insult to injury, it will also set your ting count back to 0. Tings are the basic collectible in the game, and if you get 100 of them, you get an extra life, but that's quite hard to do under these conditions. These elements added to the very difficult level design gets you a game that will make you replay it a lot. If you're going to get to the end, then merely fumbling through will not cut it. You actually need to get skilled. Very skilled. And you may find that you just have better things to do. This covers the primary and broadest reasons why the game is so hard, but this is not just a game that expects a lot of you. Rayman is meaner than that. It actively doesn't like you. So now let's go over some smaller but far more bullshit sources of difficulty. First, there's this sound. When you hear that, you've hit a trigger that has spawned some stuff somewhere in the level. This could be a platform, enemies, hazards, or collectibles. That alone can leave you in a situation where you have no way of planning what you'll be facing, but it is made worse because the triggers themselves are usually not marked visually in any way. They are purely a surprise. This can not only result in damage taken for silly reason, but times where you're stuck without a path forward until you realize you're supposed to go stand in that arbitrary spot instead of this one. If it was just secrets, fine. Not ideal, but we can work with that, and it can be really cool to find something rewarding hidden in such a way. But of course, it's on the mandatory path as well. Now you would think with a delicate life system and a requirement to thoroughly explore each region that the game wants you to plan ahead, rather than just bull rushing everything. But this obsession with spawn triggers makes that more than a little difficult. In fact, if you try to prepare for something in advance by clearing away the enemies, in the second act of bullshit they will respawn as soon as you move away. I particularly love this bullet that normally just spawns when you're up on this ledge, but if you fall it will respawn in such a way that it will probably knock you right down again before you can even see it while climbing back up. Right, so what's next then? Ah yes, hit detection. This is where the visual artistic values that Rayman is built on conflict with the gameplay. Rayman's sprite and the sprites of the various objects in the worlds just don't seem to quite line up right with their hitboxes. It's usually acceptable, and in fairness it errs on the side of favouring the player. Platforms will be just a bit bigger than you think, and enemies will be just a bit smaller. Nonetheless, it still contributes to you not being able to trust your eyes, and can often make it confusing to know exactly how safe you are in certain situations. I find it most obnoxious with Rayman's helicopter animation. Rayman's sprite is usually a nice side-on view, but when he uses his helicopter, he turns to an angle almost facing the camera with his arms and legs fanned out to give the impression of a much larger hit area than he'd normally have. In reality, the hitbox doesn't change. And that's correct, it would be stupidly annoying if Rayman would collide with something because of that. But they should have simply made an image where he was still side-on, or at least make it that he didn't take up so much more space visually. And as a quick final piece of bullshit, that Eat at Joe's level has no checkpoints throughout. None at all. Fuck those fish. And that pretty much sums up why the game is so hard, and much of that is not just difficulty, but bad design. So, Rayman is shit, right? How on earth could this be a good game with all that? What witchcraft has made it so successful? Very much so, in fact, both critically and commercially. It's even the highest selling PS1 game of all time in the UK. To answer that, we could look at external factors. It was one of the first games to come out on the PS1, a launch title, as it were. With little else to choose from, early adopters of the console would often end up with Rayman just by virtue of it being available. Then the PlayStation would go on to be very popular, balancing high power with low price. And with Rayman already established by that point, the game would have gotten even more eyeballs on it even months or years after the fact. Ansel himself admits that he's baffled by the game's sales, but I can't imagine he's complaining. Certainly Sony considers it a vital game in their history. Their re-release of the PS1 in 2018 came with 20 games preloaded onto it, and that included Rayman, one of only 2 launch titles to make the list. But that of course means that being a launch title alone was not enough, or they all would have been included. What else is going on? Well, another reason to bring up is the fact that it was a 2D game in a time where 3D was ruling the market. The idea being that the beautiful 2D world and mechanics offered was sufficiently distinct from its competition. I don't know if I agree with this one though. It certainly has aged better than the early 3D games visually, but the novelty of polygons was still a big deal at the time, and I don't think it had been long enough for people to crave 2D games again. I mean, it wasn't really until the late noughties that we truly saw 2D making a comeback. No, I don't think the context surrounding the game alone is enough. So why has this shit game gotten such a popular following? The answer is simple. It's not shit. I can harp on for ages about what's wrong with the design, indeed, I have, but it doesn't change the fact that the game just feels good to play. Rayman's moveset is extremely simple at the baseline. You have 3 buttons other than raw movement: a jump button, an action button, and, after a short time, an attack button. But simplicity doesn't mean shallow. Rayman is easy to control, but as it is with any good platformer, it's the timing, the context, and the subtle nuances that really make it work. Let's go through some specifics of the movement then, starting with momentum, or lack thereof in this case. Rayman can accelerate to top speed and fully decelerate immediately, and is able to change direction of movement in an instant. You'll eventually unlock the ability to run, which fakes momentum with a delayed stop, but still no acceleration or resistance to directional change, and even the stop delay can be circumvented by turning around or jumping. Simple and easy so far, but it gets more interesting once you leave the ground. If Rayman jumps from standing, then he has full directional control as normal, but if he's moving in either direction at the time, then he can continue moving at full speed in the chosen direction only. If you want to go back, it's possible, but substantially slower than the primary direction. This makes for a generous movement system, but will still demand some level of commitment from you at key times. Then there are slippery surfaces, a staple in platformers, and for them to work the game finally allows momentum into its controls. Rayman will now need to fight against his previous motion to go backwards, or alternatively add to it when going forwards to reach incredible speeds. This will still be the case after jumping off the slippery platform and will remain so until you land on something with a bit more friction again. Levels which use this a lot encourage you to build up that speed and trust that you can use it to your advantage in the obstacles ahead. Commitment is not just part of the experience anymore, but is everything. Then there's how platforming interacts with combat. Holding down the attack button before releasing will add to the power and range of Rayman's fist. But if you are in the air at the time of an attack, then both range and strength will be greatly increased without any need for the wind-up. This means that enemies with higher hit points or block mechanics like hunters are best fought by figuring out how to jump into an attack while avoiding hazards around you. And about jumping, there's actually two ways to do it. Pressing the jump button with normal vigor does a full height jump, but a quick tap will give you a half jump for finer areas. You'll quickly start using both as you find situations for them. Later on, you'll need a bit more control in the air, and thus the game introduces Rayman's signature helicopter ability. This allows you to hover for a short distance once per jump, and if you do not wish to hover for the full duration for any reason, it can be cancelled earlier too, but you won't be able to use that lost time for a second hover. It's sort of odd to talk about these mechanics in such detail, considering that when playing you'll be feeling these out more than explicitly thinking about them. But when you do, it really does expose just how much depth a game like this can have with just a few inputs. It's really quite stunning how elegantly all of it comes together. But that was another time. What about now? Is it still worth playing? Yeah, I'd say so. Long as you're willing to deal with the difficulty and turn your tolerance for shitty meanness up a bit. If you're not sure, well, you could try playing just the first world and see how you feel about it after that. The Dream Forest, as it's called, and unlike the rest of the game, it's not that hard. Except maybe the final area where you fight the first boss, Mosquito. The names are very creative in this game. The second world and beyond will see the difficulty climbing rapidly, but there's a good chance that the charm and humor of the game will have gripped you by this point. Not to mention the slightly strange nature of leaving a relatively believable forest world into something made of giant musical instruments. Bandland as it's called, and what's a pretty cool fun fact is that it's also a trope namer for such worlds in other games and stories. I'm going to point out one more difference between the PC and PS1 versions now. The best difference, in fact. For whatever reason, the developers decided that they needed to entirely replace the first level in Bandland for the PC port. Not remove a level, nor add one, but replace one. In the PS1 version, Bandland starts by casting you straight into a world of flying musical instruments, as seen by this GDQ playthrough. But the PC version will instead begin you on solid ground. With the green vegetation in the background still reminding us of the forest, it evokes an image of emerging from the foliage to not only rolling hills in the countryside, but hills smattered with enormous musical instruments, apparently only hidden by the density of the jungle before. From there, you eventually must climb from the ground to the recorder and drum-shaped towers above you, seamlessly transitioning us to a far more surreal place than we found ourselves in earlier. Sadly, the following lands never introduced themselves as elegantly as Bandland managed to. You could maybe argue for a soft transition to the next world as well, that's the Blue Mountains, since Bandland does eventually climb higher into the sky, and maybe you could say that you emerge from the clouds onto the mountaintops. That's still a pretty weak moment in comparison though, and the following worlds don't even go that far, they give you nothing at all. Perhaps the PC version actually set expectations too high with Bandland's introduction, but I still think it's worth it. The good news is that regardless of transition, each of the worlds is quite satisfying in isolation. They are made up of 3 or 4 areas broken down into levels in each, and end with a major boss fight, with possible encounters with minor bosses along the way. Some of the areas have a consistent theme for the levels within, while others are more just a collection of challenges. There is a bit of non-linearity in the broad layout of the game. You'll have to do all the levels eventually, but you can take alternate paths to go ahead in order to unlock new powers before completing a world if you so choose. In fact, at the first branch, I think it is better to venture into Bandland first to get the helicopter power before finishing the Dream Forest. Ditto at the second branch, going into the Blue Mountains to unlock running before finishing Bandland. But if for stylistic or difficulty reasons you would rather stay on the straightforward path, the game won't discourage you. It's nice to have, but it probably won't make a big difference to the experience. Broad strategy is not how the game keeps you engaged. It does that via a moment-to-moment approach, by consistently making you focus not on your total progress, but just on what's happening now. Every single level will offer a challenge from a broad pool of types, and with clear care taken to make sure that similar ones are never too close together. One level will rely on platforms that have tricky to navigate movements, another will instead favour slippery surfaces making movement itself the challenge, and others will slow you down with repetitive problematic enemies. The more unique screens take a form that could be called a minigame level. Sometimes this is via a power-up that only lasts until you reach the exit sign, such as the super helicopter which allows you to fly. Others will take the form of an object in the level that can be interacted with in strange ways, like these rockets that move left or right based on where you're standing on them. I quite like these systems because they are made to use the base mechanics as a middleman between you and their mechanics, rather than forcing you to adopt an entirely new control system. This is great first because it keeps your experience of playing the game consistent while taking it to new places, and second, it makes it easy to blend these systems with the more standard platforming. There are a few exceptions, but even they are not far off the normal controls. But if I had to pick what I admire most of the gameplay and level design, that would be how it is put to the purpose of storytelling. We're finally getting back onto that thread. The game tells its story most of the time not via cutscenes or dialogue, but just by being played and using the development therein to express emotional arcs. An example I've already covered is the transition to Bandland, but it goes deeper than just fluid logical travel. There's room for characterization here. Let's start with this guy, Mr. Stone, the major boss of the Blue Mountains. But this isn't the boss fight against him. That comes later. This is the first time you see him. Only a few minutes after entering the mountains, he turns up intent on turning you into paste under his foot. And all you can do is run for dear life. Almost every boss in the game has moments like this where they introduce themselves before the fight in one manner or another. How early they appear and how they choose to meet you tells a lot about them as personalities. Our friend Mr. Stone here is clearly an aggressive motherfuck who's not interested in shilly-shallying and just wants you done with ASAP. He contrasts nicely with Mr. Sax. The names are very creative in this game. My interpretation of this fellow is that he's a bit of a posh prick who dislikes dealing with Rayman directly. That's for the dirty working classes to do. He only makes a token attempt to stop you when you first meet him, and as soon as you get too close he turns around and walks out in disgust. Only when really backed into a corner does he finally put some effort into it. My favourite example of this has to be the lead up to the boss fight with Mr. Scops, the giant scorpion. He doesn't appear to care what you do in the cave so long as you don't annoy him, say, by waking him up. If you do though, my god, he will come down on you like a ton of bricks. He slams the earth and one of the crystals holding you above the lava pit below drops away. Then he attacks. Then he slams and knocks another crystal down and attacks again. He repeats this again and again until only one crystal remains. Surely that would be the end of it. There's nowhere to go if he also knocks down this one too. Yes, that's what he's aiming for. With one more slam against the ground, your last crystal is lost and you need to find an alternative way to stay out of the lava. Desperation finds that way by clinging onto Scops' platform, inches above the lava and inches below his claws, and even then he continues his attempts to knock you off it. I don't need to explain why this moment works, just look at it. This image alone really effectively portrays the power and aggression Scops is leveraging against Rayman, and just how fucked Rayman seems to be for getting himself into this. Now imagine how much stronger this feels when you are actually trying to navigate the situation yourself, not just watching it. It's so good, and such a masterclass of storytelling via gameplay. It's a little sad that when the boss fight this is leading to finally comes, it's one of the weaker fights in the game. Disappointing is a fair way to describe it, but it's not really that bad, just a bit repetitive. It being underwhelming is not a condemnation of Mr. Scops' fight, but praise for the others. They are great, some of the best I've ever played anywhere. Their attack patterns are varied and require a good understanding of your position to be effective against, but there's rarely a moment where you don't have enough warning to do what needs to be done. They don't use instant death mechanics, so the health bar makes a reliable margin of error, giving you room to focus on and practice the parts you find difficult without needing to repeat the whole fight. On the other end, the attacks are not too slow either, thus the fights never feel like they are stalling or dragging the time out. They require active participation, but are rarely asking anything unreasonable of you. They still have a few moments that are flat out unfair, but thankfully this is not the norm, especially when compared to the rest of the game. It's not just dodging attacks either, you need to think about how to do damage back. They don't follow the tired model of avoiding attacks until an obvious weak spot appears. The game puts a bit more effort in than that. They have different vulnerabilities to one another, and you need to learn how to exploit these, which sometimes involves interacting with the environment around you or with the boss's attacks themselves. To give you time to work this out for a given boss, the early stages of each encounter are fairly simple, with them just repeating one or two easy to manage attacks while you figure out the tools you need to fight back. They'll ramp things up after that though. The more damage you do to them, the more complicated their attacks become, and the faster they go. Their attacks are not chosen at random though, they will follow a predictable pattern. Thus the challenge is carefully curated to neither be too simple nor put you in impossible situations, but they will adopt a new pattern often enough that you will never get too comfortable. The net feeling of these fights is neither a chaotic mess nor a boring aside, but an exhilarating back and forth of combatants in an epic showdown. They're fantastic, both to play and in the satisfying feeling gained by reflecting afterwards. The only consistent problem is they tend to reach their final attack cycle with a few too many hit points remaining. While still challenging, the last moments of the fight become a little too predictable because of this. All the same, these are easily the best boss fights in the series. If you want to compare the average fight in every Rayman game, then none of the others even come close. If instead you want to take the best fight in a given game, then Rayman 3 has one that's competitive, but I'm still inclined to say it doesn't meet Mr. Stone or Space Mama's standard. However, there is one boss that stands out as the most important, the big bad, Mr. Dark himself. So I'd say it's time to discuss the endgame. Once you've beaten all the other worlds and freed all the Electoons, you can now enter Mr. Dark's Candy Chateau. One American word and one French, because fuck the English. I like the way the evil man's domain is a vibrant world of lollies and chocolate rather than a dark, gothic palace. Maybe that's commentary on how the happy-looking sugar products are actually designed to get us on lifelong addictions to the stuff from as young an age as possible. My god, Mr. Dark really is an evil genius. True to the game's form so far, it does an excellent job of building Mr. Dark up as a powerful threat over the course of the world. He distinguishes himself from all the bosses and challenges that came before because he can actually fuck with your controls. First by reversing the directional controls, then by forcing you to run, and finally by removing your very ability to attack. These aren't the most difficult parts of the game, but the unique nature of having your interface with the world screwed up makes it stand out because they feel more personal than anything you've faced thus far. He's not only messing with Rayman, he's messing with you. Now without your fist, Mr. Dark decides the time is right to confront you one-on-one, when you are literally powerless to fight back. He will take his time to toy with you at first, effectively making you dance while he shoots at your feet. But when he does finally decide to finish you off, he'll surround you with fire and slowly close it together around you. There appears to be no way out, but in the last minute, the Electoons you saved over the course of the game return the favor. They recover your fist and bring it back to you, and now it's really on. All of this is excellent, and yet another showcase of how great the storytelling in Rayman is. But from this point, the ending really drops the ball. Mr. Dark sods off, and you are attacked by a series of creatures whose bodies are a mangled combination of the previous bosses already defeated. These fights are okay, decent enough in their design, but simple. They feel like a final precursor before the actual fight with Mr. Dark. But they are not. They are the final boss fight. Once you beat them, Rayman throws his hands in the air, says, "Excellent!" And that's the end. Credits. So, what happened here? Did Mr. Dark turn himself into these creatures to fight you, or did he literally just say, "Fuck it, I'm out," and set them on you to cover his escape? Also, remember Rayman's ally Batilla the Fairy was captured? Literally the only plot development in the game? That's not addressed either. I suppose she's dead then. She's not in the next game after all. And then there's the Great Protoon. We can infer that it was restored, but what was Mr. Dark doing with it? Or at least where was he keeping it? For that matter, what does destroying it mean for the vast majority of living creatures in this world? Do they die or do they just become friendly? You know, what does it even mean for it to be restored? Nothing. Just nothing, but an abrupt and unsatisfying ending, both narratively and mechanically. The only joy I've ever gotten from this is laughing at how incompetent it is. At very least, the build-up throughout the final world could have led to a great mechanical climax had there been an explicit Mr. Dark fight instead of these mutant creatures he sends at you. And that feels like some really obvious advice. I don't really understand why it was done this way. When the ending of a game seems rushed, I usually look to time and money to explain that, but I don't think that's sufficient here. If the ending had been mechanically exactly the same, but Mr. Dark Sprite was used instead of these creatures, it would have worked a lot better, and surely making those sprites and animating them would have taken more resources rather than saving any. With that in mind, the only other answer I could come up with was poor management. Effort was put into making these assets that weren't needed or even helpful, and were not put into what should have been the big climactic moment of the game. I could be wrong about that, but if so, I would really like to know why these decisions were made. It's such a shame that the ending was what suffered the most, but the game is only about that moment when that moment is happening. Throughout the rest of the game, it's about whatever is happening at the time. The mechanics, the art, the music, the interactive storytelling, they all work best in the instant that they are occurring, and that's how the game thrives. The broader picture never felt all that important in comparison. The ending might spell absolute doom for other games, but Rayman can weather it, because the rest of the game consistently lived up to its promise. And even after that, there's still the fact that you not only beat a game, but you beat a game that hates you. Going back to Eat at Joe's, yes, I have literally hours of suffering with this level in my memory, but after all that, I can actually do it semi-reliably now. The game is trying to be mean to me still, but I've risen above it, and there's something smug about that. Maybe that's why, despite all the problems, the game still has a fond place in my mind. Well, that and nostalgia, but still. If you liked the video, then, like it. And I'll see you next time.